We have the honor of having with us right now Secretary of Natural Resources Molly Ward, who is going to introduce to us Congressman Wittman. So we have a great lineup. Secretary Ward is a native of Hampton and a graduate of the University of Virginia and the William and Mary Law School. Did I repeat myself? Oh, sorry. She is admitted to both federal, district, and state courts, and during her career has handled a wide range of matters, including cases involving environmental issues, land use, and planning. She served as the elected treasurer for the city of Hampton from 2002 until 2008. I know many of us know her from that time. Reworking the operations from an ineffective bureaucracy to focus on customer service and measurable results. She was then rewarded by being elected mayor of the city of Hampton in 2008 and was elected to a second term in 2012. And as mayor, she led a diverse, historic city with 140,000 residents and represented the interests of the city and the Hampton Roads region at the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission on issues related to water quality, the Chesapeake Bay, and guess what? Sea level rise. Perfect. Secretary Ward led the bipartisan delegation that persuaded former President Obama to make Fort Monroe a national monument, the president's first Antiquities Act designation. She was appointed to serve on the Virginia Outdoors Foundation by Governor Tim Kaine, and was on the board that contributed to the governor's goal of preserving 400,000 Virginia acres. She served as a special assistant to the president and deputy director of intergovernmental affairs at the White House before being appointed as Secretary of Natural Resources by Governor McAuliffe. Welcome, Secretary Ward.
It's sort of strange to have an introduction of the person who's doing an introduction. So, but thank you very much, Elizabeth. I'm very honored today to be here to introduce Congressman Wittman. Congressman Wittman and I go way back to my local government days, and he has always been a great friend to the city of Hampton and to the Commonwealth. A lot of people don't know that our Virginia congressional delegation does not stand on party lines when it comes to issues in Virginia. They work together as a team. They meet regularly. And Rob has brought a bipartisan approach to many problems that I've worked with him on, even though we are on different sides of the aisle. We worked on water quality issues and Chesapeake Bay issues when I was in local office, and have continued to do so since I've worked for Governor McAuliffe. He's very passionate about the Bay, and he hails from the Northern Neck and has a deep affection and connection with the water, and understands the challenges of subsidence and sea level rise, and the challenges that we have with regards to water programs throughout the Commonwealth. When I was first mayor, Joe Frank was then mayor of Newport News, who also has a big fat D next to his name, and he reached out to me, Joe Frank did, and asked me if I would partner with him to do a luncheon for Rob. And we did, and I hope you remember that we had this great group of bipartisan leaders who came together and worked together, and that's the kind of attitude he brings to everything he does. My grandfather would have said that he is a gentleman and a scholar, which is the highest compliment you can give someone who is fair and kind and also studies hard. Don't get involved into a debate with him on the facts or the law or a regulation, because he knows his stuff, and he's a little bit of a wonky nerd that way. But it's extremely admirable, and I'm very proud to introduce him and proud to call him my friend, and look forward to hearing what he has to say.
Well, Molly, thank you, and good afternoon. What a real honor and privilege it is to be here with you today. To reflect upon the challenges that we all face here in our coastal region of Virginia. They are significant challenges, but one that I believe that we are all up to. As we see what's happening in our region with recurrent flooding, we understand that this is a reality that surrounds all of us, a reality that from every level of government we have to address. And I argue that it is really an issue where local governments have to work together with state government, who has to work together with federal government to make sure that we cover the full spectrum of what needs to happen here. My role on the House Armed Services Committee is specific to what happens with our nation's military. One of the military's main jobs is to generate readiness. How do we make sure when necessary we have the capability to defend America's interests across the globe? And that's in every aspect, whether it's through our Navy, through our Air Force, through our Marine Corps, or through our Army. All of those things are extraordinarily important. Virginia has and continues to play an extraordinarily important role in this nation's defense. Whether it's Norfolk Naval Facility, whether it's Langley Air Force Base, whether it's Fort Eustis, whether it is Training Center Yorktown for the United States Coast Guard, our region reflects every element of our nation's military. And the Coast Guard, while not under DOD, still projects that mission of homeland security and, in times of national emergency, national security. So all of those elements are reflected here in our region. The question then becomes, how do we take what we see happening around us? How do we see the impact of recurrent flooding on our nation's military? And it is plain and simple and straightforward. We see places like Langley Air Force Base that has to generate capacity with our United States Air Force, both with tactical aircraft, that is our fighter aircraft, as well as strategic aircraft. You know, aircraft are great, but they don't perform quite as well if they're on the ground as they do if they're in the air. So when Langley Air Force Base needs to generate that opportunity to train or to deploy, those aircraft have to be able to take off. It's kind of hard to take off if the tarmac there has water on it. So with that, we understand the impact that recurrent flooding has on places like Langley Air Force Base. In fact, on average, about 9 days a year, operational capacity on the base is affected by recurrent flooding. The same at Norfolk Naval Facility, where we have to make sure that sailors can get back and forth to their ships, either for training or for deployment. And if they can't because of flooding, that takes away that operational capability that's necessary there, both in the training and the operation and maintenance of those ships. When that's impacted each year, somewhere between 10 and 12 days a year, that has an impact. And I know everybody wants to make sure that those sailors, those airmen, those soldiers, and those Marines, and those Coast Guardsmen have the capability through the training and operations that are pursued here in Virginia. You go to Fort Eustis, and as you know, Fort Eustis and Langley Air Force Base are all interrelated now in that they jointly manage the base. A lot of folks don't understand, too, that actually the Navy's got a lot of ships, but the Army has a few more. And a number of those ships are actually at Fort Eustis. So when you look at those coastal flooding events and you see where the James River port is there for Fort Eustis, and you see the impact there, too, on what happens at that dockage, we see that the Army is also impacted by these recurrent flooding events. So as we've laid down what the impact is here in Virginia, the question then becomes, now what's the next step? What do we do from a public policy standpoint to address that? What do we do in making sure that those military facilities don't lose any element of being able to generate readiness? Readiness is the key element today. We have seen a loss of readiness because of lack of action in Washington, because of things like the sequester that have taken dollars away that have impacted readiness. This year we have addressed that and said we need to be putting dollars back into the accounts that generate readiness, which means the training, the operation and maintenance of our forces. One of the areas that we must address, I believe, is operational days and readiness that are lost due to these recurrent flooding events. And obviously here in Virginia, we want to understand what that is. There have been a number of efforts on the Armed Services Committee this year. I was happy to work with the College of William & Mary in getting into the National Defense Authorization Act language that requires our military to address the impacts of recurrent flooding. I want to make sure that we have an objective measure of that, so understanding how that affects our military installations is key in what we do going forward. I want to make sure that it is now reflected in what the military does, both in how they operate on a day-to-day basis, but also how they make investments into the future. As we all know, the DOD has already issued a guide on what the response to recurrent flooding should be. It's great to come up as to what the response is going to be, but a response in this case is only a short-term response. That is, what happens when a road floods? What do we do? What do we do to create a contingency plan so we can continue operations? Sometimes it can't be done. Sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes you have to deploy assets just to maintain minimal function there. That's great, but the more compelling question is now what do we do in the long term? You know, we have contingency plans on what we do in the short term. What if the road floods today? But the question needs to become, what happens when the road floods not 9 times this year at Langley Air Force Base, but what happens if in the future it now floods 15 times a year, 20 times a year, 30 times a year? What do we do? That's the reality of what we have to deal with. Separate all of the back and forth of what's the cause behind this. The reality is we are dealing with this on an annual basis. What do we do from a public policy standpoint to make sure that we have solutions, not just in the short term, but what do we do to make sure the solutions are there in the long term? As you know, the Navy has also directed a handbook to guide and to participate in a land use study here in the Hampton Roads area, an overall look about what do we do to make sure we are addressing these issues. I argue that it is a hand-in-hand approach because the infrastructure and the impacts on that across Hampton Roads are interrelated between our bases and between our localities. How do we look at things that we can do to make sure that if we deploy resources, we deploy them to the maximum utility possible? So if there's going to be an investment in a region, we want to make sure that it's not an investment that just is beneficial to Norfolk Naval Facility, but how do we make an investment that is also beneficial to the region? So maybe we ought to look at how do we take resources that come from the state level, resources that come from the federal level, and combine them to get the maximum utility possible. Those are the types of things that I think can take place through these types of studies to understand how do we make the best use of these resources. I want to make sure, too, that as we have the discussion that we are engaging folks at every level of government and make sure that there is a clear definition about what each element of government can do. What is it that local governments can do? What is it that they have within their realm to do? What are the investments that they are going to make? What can the state do? There's a lot of opportunities there, I think, at the state level to make sure that the attention to recurrent flooding, to coastal flooding, is raised to a higher level to make sure that it's not just a response to episodic events, that it's a long-term perspective in saying we're going to look at this day in and day out to where everything that happens at the state level is a focus on where this is going, not just in the short term, but in the long term. When you raise it to that level, then you have longer-term public policy solutions that are put in place because you have put more attention to that within all elements of government, not just in the legislative branch, but also in the executive branch. I think there's great opportunities there to use other ways, too, to look at how do we leverage resources. I talked a little bit about looking at where state resources could be leveraged with federal resources, but we also ought to look at where local governments are leveraging resources to address these long-term impacts. And how do we make sure, too, that in those instances we can also leverage private dollars? There, I think, are opportunities where private dollars are used to leverage that with dollars at the local, state, and federal level to do even more, to make sure we to make sure we have the right perspective in how that is not only taking place, but how the planning takes place and how, again, we get best use of those resources. To look at things like the Virginia Pooling Finance Plan, to make sure you're pooling resources from a number of different areas, looking at ways where you can take resources that might be longer-term investments and do that in a way that helps localities and, again, create some certainty about where we're going with providing solutions to the recurrent flooding issues. All of those, I think, are opportunities. We on the Armed Services Committee have a continued focus on that. There's a little bit of bifurcation in how the issues of base infrastructure occur. Within the Congress, there's the Armed Services Committee, and we are essentially relegated to the operational aspects of the military. The capital investments on the military occur within the military construction element of decision-making, which is part of the Veterans Affairs Committee. The appropriations side happens within a different subcommittee. There's a subcommittee on appropriations within the Appropriations Committee. There's also a subcommittee on military construction. The question then becomes, is there crossover? Is there crossover with operational aspects of what recurrent flooding does to military readiness and what happens with decisions on infrastructure investments? I would argue that there is probably some crossover there. The question is how do we make sure that in unison that the appropriators and the folks that oversee military construction are working in conjunction with folks on the Armed Services Committee to make sure we look at, again, how are resources best used. We don't want duplication of resources. We want to make sure we have the same mindset on what we're going to do with that. I think in next year's National Defense Authorization Act, it would be good to dive even deeper into depth into this and to look at, what's the impact on every military base that is in an area that has or is subjected to recurrent flooding. And how many instances do we have? What's the exact nature of those instances? What's the impact on base operations? We have overall plans to address this in the future, but it'd be nice to have an objective measure about what's happening now so we can use that framework to go forward and say, here's the foundation upon which we will have the discussion of what the impact is today, and then what do we do to respond to that, projecting what that may be in the future to make sure, again, that we have that long-term vision. Most of what's occurring today is saying what's happening in the short term. And it's great to have a solution in the short term, but having this additional information to have a longer-term strategy, I think, is the key. For our region, obviously, Virginia has been a critical partner with this nation's defense to assure that we have the capability, capacity, and readiness necessary. Virginia will continue to be a partner. We have to make sure that we provide for those bases to continue to operate. If they lose operational capacity at some critical point, the military branches will look elsewhere and say, well, if we don't get what we need out of this base operations because we have interruptions from recurrent flooding, maybe we need to look at other areas. Obviously, we don't want that to happen in Virginia. We think Virginia has been a tremendous partner with our military, will continue to be, and that means the challenges we face have to be done at every level of government and have to be done in a timely manner. That means as we're looking at these things occurring, it can't be years and years out in the future. We have to look at what do we do today to have that long-term perspective on how to fix these challenges that our military bases are facing. So I appreciate the opportunity to have the discussion. One of the other elements, too, that we can't forget is what happens on the side of preserving other natural elements of our environment that I think are critical to addressing issues of recurrent flooding. One of those areas is wetlands. We continue to lose a tremendous amount of wetlands every year. Wetlands are Mother Nature's sponge, they're Mother Nature's buffer, and as we lose those wetland areas, we see the impacts that they have. In fact, I was just in West Point, and I was talking there about recurrent flooding at the very end of the town of West Point. There's an area there that now begins to flood, and the question is, why is that happening? And the first response I got after asking that question was, well, Rob, the wetlands in the area of town where the Mattaponi and Pamunkey River come together have changed significantly. And again, anecdotally, from a member of the town council there, he said, I believe that the impact on our town in those areas and the larger impacts that we see is because of the change in the wetlands there. And the change is the wetlands footprint has gotten smaller. So we can't forget, too, the impacts that our natural systems have on what we deal with coastal flooding. And I want to make sure we continue to protect those wetlands. That's why I'm proud to be the co-sponsor of the North American Wetlands Conservation Act. Again, a great example of taking private dollars, leveraging them with public dollars, putting them into preserving those critical habitats in our wetlands to make sure that we have Mother Nature as an ally with us in mitigating or in adapting to coastal flooding. Those things, I think, are absolutely critical, and I will continue along those lines, too, to make sure we look at natural systems as part of this overall solution to where we need to be with recurrent flooding. So, folks, thanks again. I want to thank especially all the folks that are part of today's support for this event, College of William and Mary and all the partners that you saw up on the board. But, folks, thanks again. I really appreciate everybody in the room today. It's obvious that there's a great cross-section of our region, from our military to academia to private sector. It really is going to take that joint effort to make sure that we elevate our decision-making, we elevate devotion of resources, we elevate public policy to the level to get these things done and to get them done in a timely way. So again, thank you to everybody in the room. It's a real honor and a privilege for me to be here with you today to share a few thoughts about what we need to do now and what we need to do in the future. And I look forward to continuing the dialogue and making sure that we, through our office, as well as other members of the Virginia Congressional Delegation and every level of government, are part of providing the solution going into the future to make sure that our military bases are able to adapt to this, but also making sure too that our localities and our state government are part of that partnership there, and that we keep in mind the importance of natural systems in the overall solution of this. Folks, thanks again. Appreciate the opportunity.
Terrific. Are there any questions for Congressman Wittman?
The big elephant in the room, I suspect, for about 95% of the people, is we're dealing with resilience, which is an acceptance of things as they shall be coming. So the question is, in most big public issues, we actually try to get back to the cause. And you mentioned in West Point, they said the cause was the marsh was shrinking, but there's a cause for the marsh to shrink in the first place. So earlier we had a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense who couldn't utter climate change. It has to be changing climate. So I think 2/3 of the American public believes that climate change is occurring, and 2/3 actually believe it's caused by humans, and I think most of us who are scientists would say it's contributed to. So what is your point of view on this whole issue of climate change? Shouldn't we be doubling down on eliminating the cause, or at least slowing or reducing the cause, and instead of pulling out of the treaty, for example, actually trying to push it harder?
Sure. Rob, I think today, if we're going to make progress in the public policy realm, we should be looking at places that unite people. If we get into getting into the areas where name calling begins, and that's exactly what happens when you get into say, what's the cause, then everybody takes their side and says, no, I'm not going to do this, no, I'm not going to do that. The place where we can all agree, I believe, is that as human beings, based on the conditions around us, we must adapt. And we must do that in order to preserve the economics of our region, to preserve the capability within our military. I believe if we lay the foundation to do that, if we do the things that we all agree upon, that builds a foundation to have a rational and thoughtful discussion about other issues surrounding this. If we don't, if we tend to go to the other issues and say, well, everybody's going to get entrenched in their camps, we find a very, very difficult place to be to actually be able to pursue public policy. Adaptation, I think, is one of those base issues that most everybody can agree with. Let's start there. Let's have that discussion. Let's show that we can get some things done there by agreeing. And in today's realm of deep political divisions, I think people want us to be getting things done. Let's focus on getting things done. Let's show that we can do that. And from there, we can have the discussion about other issues that are surrounding what we're dealing with today, and that is the reality of recurrent flooding and the impacts on coastal areas.
Anyone else?
And any other questions? I promise I won't bite.
This is your chance.
Yeah.
Rob, practically speaking,
Yes.
how do we take those steps involving local, state, federal cooperation to actually take a step so everybody can see the step was taken and be encouraged to take the next one? How do we get it started? Concrete.
The question from President Reevely is, how do we get this started? How do we get folks engaged at the local, state, and federal government levels to actually begin the process of developing public policy, devoting resources? You know, I think days like today, where you bring a number of different folks from across the political perspectives and folks in the policy-making realm to say, yes, number one, this is an issue that we have to deal with. It does have an impact on us economically. It has an impact on us strategically. What are the things that we need to do? Also making sure, too, that we have those clear, objective elements about how you build public policy decisions. And then look at where, again, we have agreement with what local governments say that they believe need to be done, what the state says needs to be done, and what the federal government says needs to be done. And we're beginning down that road to put together what the directives are, the basis of objective information that says, hey, here are the things we have to deal with. Here are the days where we impact operations on military bases. That's real. that comes to us directly from the military. And then the question is, okay, what's happening in the region? Where are the other impacts, which there are, on those recurrent events, not just on the military base, but where is it on localities? What happens with communities now that continually are flooded? Are we elevating those homes? What do we do in those areas? Are we making engineering changes to be able to mitigate the impacts of that flooding or adapt to that flooding effort? Those are the places where we can, I think, find the place of agreement in public policy, find places where we can actually take the resources that are there, leverage them together, look at what is the plan for a locality. You can't separate. Let's take for instance the city of Poquoson, where you have Langley Air Force Base right next door. There are opportunities there for us to look at the impacts, and we've seen it. I've visited there many times and seen the impacts of coastal flooding in that area. The question then becomes, how do we take what Poquoson sees as the issue? How do we take what the state sees as the issue? How do we take what happens at Langley, put all those things together and say, if we're going to make an investment, if we're going to set public policy, how do we do that in the area that has the maximum utility? So how do we take and combine what Langley is doing to address it, what the state is doing to address it, and what Poquoson is doing to address it, and come up with an overall strategy and plan? You see that beginning here in the Hampton Roads area to say, what is it? What's the scope of the problem? And then the question is what should the priorities be? Where do we dedicate resources? You won't be able to get it all done at one time, but what you can do is to prioritize and said, these elements of government are in agreement. The first thing we need to do is A, and the second thing we need to do is B. And those things will have the maximum immediate impact on the issue, and those are the places where we can put our resources. And then from there, as we devote more resources, can go down the list and have more and more impact. But that has to be a joint effort. If you bifurcate it or if you fragment it, you're going to see resources move in different directions, sometimes maybe at counter purposes to each other. And remember, too, by doing it that way, President Reevely, I think we can accelerate the learning curve. We can go in and say, hey, these are the things that we've done. This is where things have worked. And if there are things that don't work, what we want to make sure in that realm is we fail quickly. Let's fail quickly. Let's move on and do something else. I'm not an advocate of failure, but I'm an advocate that when you do fail quickly and move on and say, hey, this didn't work, we're going to try something else. Those are elements where I think we can do the most good. Opportunities like we have today is the way to make sure we get the discussion to the point of not only acknowledging the scope and the breadth of the problem, but developing what the public policy paths are, and then how do we bring resources together to apply to the public policy path to make those things happen. Sure. Yes.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And thank you for your service to our Commonwealth.
Thank you. Thank you.
This particular suggestion came out. My name is Sherry Neal. I'm with the City of Portsmouth. I'm the Intergovernmental Affairs Manager there. And we're currently working on our state and federal 2018 legislative packages. And one of the issues that recently came up from the community was the fact that for persons who have homes that have already paid off their mortgages, the only way that they can get flood insurance is if they pay in a lump sum, which is problematic to a lot of people who are retired or limited incomes. And if there was a way that they could possibly do it in incremental payments, that's not attached to an escrow because you don't have a mortgage, that would be helpful. So currently, there are two bills, the two bipartisan bills in Congress. One is House Resolution 3285, and the other one is Senate Bill, I have it in here, 1368, and they are entitled the Sustainable, Affordable, Fair, Efficient National Flood Insurance Program Reauthorization for 2017.
Yeah.
They seem to be stalled, like a lot of things up there. But both of these bills would allow that to happen, for people to be able to make these payments. And I think if that was something that's like a small step that we could take that would help mitigate the fiscal impacts to local, state, and federal coffers, if these people's homes who get damaged in floods have insurance to cover their losses rather than coming to the government looking for it. So I just wanted to know if you were familiar with that or where you stand on that particular issue. Thank you.
Well, I am, and reauthorizing the federal flood insurance program is critical, but making sure, too, that we design it to where flood insurance continues to be affordable And I understand with all the things that have happened with these recent events, the insurance markets are trying to respond to that, and the reinsurance markets are trying to respond to that. What we want to make sure is that we understand fully the impacts on coastal communities. I've been working with other colleagues there, and including folks like Garrett Graves, who's from Louisiana. His district is very similar to mine with the amount of coastal areas we have there and the impacts. We have had some great conversations about what needs to be in that bill. The reauthorization bill will probably take 7 other different bills and combine them together. One of those is affordability and flexibility in premium payments for the flood insurance program. What do we do at the federal level, not only to underwrite the program to help in managing the cost of the premiums, but then what do we do too in areas that are affected by recurrent flooding? How do we make the best investment? How do we make sure we're not continually going in event after event after event and doing the same thing and essentially not using those dollars to the highest and best use? So we want to make sure we're looking at that across the board. How are insurance markets constructed? How are FEMA flood maps put together? How do we make sure we have the most recent information there to make sure that they accurately reflect that so people aren't being negatively affected by an old FEMA map that says that they either are or are not in a floodplain and then later find themselves with a premium that's gone up significantly because they get reclassified? All those things are part of that. I've been working with a number of members on the Financial Services Committee that are charged with this, and excluding Chairman Hensarling, Jeb Hensarling, who's the chairman there. Now, he's from Texas, and he's from an area that doesn't have a whole lot of water around it, so his perspective is a little bit different. But I can tell you that members like myself and Garrett Graves and others have been chewing on his ear constructively, and I think he's developing a deep sense of appreciation for what coastal communities have to deal with flood insurance. Remember, too, that flood insurance has to continue to be affordable. If it is not, you cannot originate a loan in the floodplain without having flood insurance. If you can't afford flood insurance and you don't pay it and your policy lapses, that's reason for default on your mortgage. So if we have that, it could be catastrophic on coastal communities if you have defaults on mortgages and then those homes not being able to be sold because flood insurance is unaffordable. So we understand the broad impacts that it has. We want to make sure that it's a manageable program and that it reflects what we think is the proper perspective on risk and risk sharing and what the role government needs to play in those areas, and then what are we doing in the best long-term policies to make sure that we don't have to come back time after time after time in communities. We want to make sure that they are, again, made resilient through the dollars that are being spent. Anyone else? Well, folks, again, thank you so much. What an honor and privilege to be here with you today. Thanks.
I just have to say that Representative Wittman has been such a great supporter to the Coastal Policy Center. He's spoken at a prior conference before, and in addition, I hit him up this summer when we were both speaking at a meeting and said, we're going to have this conference, and this is the theme. And from day one, he was enthusiastic, so we really appreciate all of your support. Thank you. And also on that note, I want to point out to you that we do have letters in your packet from Senators Kane and Warner. The Senate was in session today, and traffic being what it is on 95, there's no way they could get down here to join us. So they did send some letters of support. Congressman Scott was also held up in Washington, D.C. He sent a letter that's out on the table. It was for our Tidewater movie showing last night. So we really appreciate the congressional delegation and all their support that they're showing to this important topic.